Order. And welcome to you once again, gentlemen, and thank you for joining the Scottish Affairs Committee and our inquiry into immigration in Scotland. And we're very grateful to the Edinburgh Centre for Carbon Innovation for hosting this session today. And maybe just by way of an opening statement, if there's anything you'd like to say to the committee, a brief statement of that. We'll start with you, Mr. Park. And for the record, just tell us who you are and what organisation that you represent, please.
My name is Michael Park, and I'm Chief Executive of the Scottish Whitefish Producers Association, that represents the bulk of the UK fishing industry. Our vessels range from small to large, offshore to inshore, and we're very much involved in the political arena, which currently includes the Brexit arena.
Thank you. Mr. Thompson.
I'm David Thompson. I'm Chief Executive of the Food and Drink Federation in Scotland. We are a trade association for food manufacturers. We're part of the UK FTF, but in Scotland we have our own board and team. And obviously our interests are in food and soft drink manufacturing. Brexit is of critical concern to that industry.
Grateful to both of you for that. Thank you. This is the first of our sessions with some of the sectoral interests when it comes to immigration. Perhaps we could start just with a general question. Just maybe you could tell us how important migrant labour is to both your sectors, and how dependent and reliant your sectors may be on the ability to recruit migrant labour. We'll start with you, Mr. Thompson.
It's of enormous importance. In food and drink manufacturing alone, we estimate around 30% of all labour comes from the European Union outside of the UK. So obviously that's a significant concern, and that's in Scotland alone, that's in around 30 or 40,000 people at least in manufacturing alone. If you then go into other sectors, including farming, fishing, and the retailing sector, then obviously there are significant issues there as well. So migration from the EU is fundamental to the food and drink industry.
Mr. Park.
Yes, I guess our interest in this is significantly different in that the catching sector is primarily dependent on non-EEA crew. About 1,200 foreign workers in the industry, 800 of which are from the countries of the Philippines, Indonesia and Sri Lanka. Obviously, onshore processors, slightly different. They depend on EEA workers, and there's about 8,000 sort of fish processors in Scotland. They're 70% dependent on EEA workers. So you can understand that for the fishing industry, in terms of the catching sector, we're not a big sector. I think we employ about 0.2% of the total employable people in Scotland, so we're not big, but is a sector that very much props up the coastal communities. So for us, it's a very significant issue.
Is there any particular reason why both your sectors are so reliant on migrant labour? Is it particular skills they bring, or is it difficult in recruiting amongst the native populations? What's behind this?
In terms of the catching sector, who I represent, it goes away back to the 90s, the collapse of the stocks, the introduction of the precautionary principle by the Commission, which sought at that time to try and rebuild stocks. Opportunities to the fleet declined, profitability and revenue as a result declined, and men then saw fishing as not their first choice of profession. We then had decommissioning schemes in 2001, 2003, which removed a significant number of vessels from the sector, and then we've seen a wholehearted shift to the oil industry. And you can understand where I come from, up in the northeast of Scotland. Oil industry is booming, they can give job prospects, great holidays, better conditions, promotions, all the things that in our sector we couldn't necessarily do at that time. And that saw a significant shift from fishing to oil and other sort of industries. We've fought hard to try and recover that position, and this last year is the first year that it's the best year for profitability of the fleet and the revenue streams. But for the first time, my own organisation has put 32 young entrants through training. We've retained 31. Now, that's the first significant retention we've ever had for a long, long time. In years prior to that, we were putting through 25 to 30 and retaining 1 or 2 because obviously they didn't see the prospects as being in that particular sector for the future.
I'm grateful. I'm just looking at some of the figures here, and we're seeing that you've got 19.3% from non-EEA countries. Could you tell us just a little bit about where these people come from and what attracts them to want to come all the way to Scotland and work in beautiful areas like Mr. Dukett's? I mean, what's the motivating factor and feature for these people to come here?
Yeah, I can tell you. Originally, when we had to move to foreign crew or non-UK crew, it was the Eastern European sector that tended to fill the gap. But as they came across and they saw how difficult the sector was to work in, they then gravitated towards onshore. employment, which meant that we then had to look for something else. The skill set that people from fishermen from the Filipinos, Indonesia, Sri Lanka bring is quite unique. I mean, it's not unlike our own fishermen in the northeast of Scotland. My own organisation...
The Philippines is like Ban van Bokken then, yeah?
The skill set that they bring is very much the same. So we're talking about skill sets. We're not talking about culture, it's skill sets. And the skill set that they bring is very much the same as the skill set of Scottish fishermen. My own organisation, we have 2 trips a year across to Sri Lanka, Indonesia and the Philippines to go and visit the families, to make sure that they're satisfied, and to make sure also that the agents are making sure that they filter out so we do get that necessary skill set.
Same question to you, Mr Thompson. Why are your sector so reliant on migrant labour?
It's a huge range of issues. Some of it is around geography, as Mike has said. So obviously food and drink manufacturing is very prevalent in the northeast of Scotland, and it suffers the same pressures of the oil industry and others. Part of it is to do with different employment opportunities now. So if you were in Murray, you would quite easily see the impact of the development of supermarkets and others which offer a different type of job to people than perhaps was the case 20 or so years ago. But you also have differences in skills as well. The organisations that I represent are crying out for engineering skills, but also food science and technology skills, new product development skills. And those aren't as readily available in Scotland as perhaps they should be. And so there's an area there. And also there's an element where food and drink manufacturing in the industry isn't seen as the most attractive of places to work, and therefore that's one of the things that we work very hard on with money from Skills Development Scotland to try and promote the sector with our Future in Food campaign. But it's a hard job, and you have to convince teachers and parents that there's a great career in the industry.
Grateful. David Dukin.
Thank you, Chair. Mr Park, this question is specifically for you about the fishing. Your written submission states that the use of migrant workers to supplement crew and vessels in the Scottish fleet is a short to medium-term measure. Do you think that in the long term it will be possible for the Scottish fleet to get back to getting back to a full local workforce? And how long do you think that might take? And what needs to be done in the meantime to make that happen?
Our aspirations are that in the medium to long term we can basically fill the Scottish fishing industry with home crew. That's dependent on conditions, and we're satisfying some of that requirements just now with new vessel builds over the 3-year period. We'll probably build 40 new vessels, which have silly things like, internet aboard them, Sky aboard them, and that's quite. It's almost a determining factor on whether a young person takes a job nowadays is for accessibility to the sort of Wi-Fi and other things. As I said and I mentioned previously, that in the past, lack of revenue, lack of opportunities, lack of wages to the sector has led to a downturn in employment. Fishing is one of the last hunting occupations, and our fishermen are paid on a sort of share wage structure. And that's good when you're making loads of money and there's loads of opportunities. Not so good as in the turn of the century, the 90s, and I fished for 30 years. I had my own 2 boats. I employed 16 people. So I went through that sort of era. Wages were declining 10, 20% year on year. And that meant that everybody was just moving away from the sector. But now what we have in fishing is an industry that's in parity with the oil sector, and in some cases above the oil sector in terms of rewards now. So we hope over the next 2 to 3 years to see that gradual increase. And remember that the new entrants we used to get into the industry were from the coastal communities. You'll see in that submission that we get very few people from cities away from the coastline. And as they see this profitable industry taking part in the harbours and the shores, they then themselves want to be a part of that. It's about hearsay at schools. Until recently, we were putting careers people into the schools, and we got not one young person coming to the table because the parents were saying to them, this is not a profession for you. But now we're seeing a change because they now see revenue coming in, they see professionalism, they see investment, they see enthusiasm, and we're now seeing that return. As I say, 31 new entrants this year. For us, that's just the start.
And how long do you think it might take to get back to? Because obviously there's a generational thing. If you're saying young kids nowadays are just now getting back into the idea that fishing's a career for them, how long do you think it would take to get back to a fully local workforce? To
be honest, I mean, self-sufficiency, probably about 10 years, because what we're failing to factor in there is the fact that the pool of people that we can draw from is significantly smaller now than from it was in the 80s. If you go look back then at the number of people going on to secondary education, significantly smaller than what it is now. You now look at the amount of people willing to take a job where they get their hands dirty, significantly smaller than what it was. So the emphasis in trying to extract more out of that pool is almost, I mean, it's evident on us. How we go about that and how we deliver it, I guess, is the challenge. But that 31 this year is the initial signs that things are starting to recover.
Okay, thank you.
The 31 you refer to, is that new crews or is that new vessels that are being...
No, that's over a 3-year period. We will build about 40 vessels, which is an investment between 250 and 300 million. But this year we've brought in 31 new entrants, and that's my own organisation fund them to come in, to actually put them through their 4 basic courses and get them on vessels. They have to be sponsored by a skipper. We then have a follow-up assessment of whether these young men are still aboard the boat they started. If they're not, where now are they? What was the reason for shifting? So that we can create some analysis as to the incentives for them doing whatever they do.
Grateful. Thank you. Tommy Sherrod.
So that's with regard to the people at sea. You think within 10 years you might have a mainly local workforce?
Yes, yes.
What are the trends in terms of the onshore part of the industry in manufacturing? Do you think you might also see a more local workforce 10 years from now than you have? And if not, what do you think are the implications for tighter migration on that sector?
I mean, I don't represent the onshore sector, but I mean, they are 70% dependent on EA workforce currently. Now, I think they themselves are having difficulty getting people in to do filleting, for instance, and it's quite a high-paid job, fish filleting, and other jobs within the processing sector. But I know they themselves are having a difficulty recruiting into that sector. Now, how that will change, I'm not so knowledgeable of. I mean, I don't know the processes they're putting in place to try and solve that problem. But I do know that up in the northeast, they're trying to build a centre there to draw people in to try and start fill the sort of voids that they see coming, if indeed they do come. But it's a different problem they have compared to what we have. They can currently get access to labour, although that may change. We have difficulty, certainly within the 12 mile, getting access to labour, and indeed that may change going forward as well.
Okay.
Grateful, thank you. Just to Ross and Danielle, just any questions you want, just make sure you catch my eye and make sure you can come in, yeah? And we're now for Paul.
Hi, morning panel. In the UK, we effectively have a bit of a two-tier structure to immigration whereby EU citizens are largely unrestricted in their ability to come to Scotland and work, but for non-EU citizens it's heavily restricted. How well would you say the current arrangements meet the needs of businesses within your particular sectors? And I don't know, Mr Thompson, you want to take that one first?
It obviously works very well for us. That's why we have, in different parts of the sector, sometimes up to 70, 80, 90% European Union. But that's where most of the workers come from. It's from European Union rather than from other parts of the world in the processing sector, because it's easy, because people can see the opportunities in doing it, and because people have an economic reason to come to the UK in order to do it. So for us, that system obviously works very well. That's the answers in the numbers. I think what we, looking forward, there will have to be a new migration system of some sort. And really, from the point of view of food and drink manufacturers who are employing tens of thousands of people across the UK, potentially from out with the UK, then obviously it has to be easy, it has to be simple, and it has to be simple both for the person and for the company itself. To do that, and I'm not sure that the current restrictions on the rest of the world are going to be fit for purpose for the food and drink industry.
Yeah, I mean, obviously for us it doesn't work well at all. I mean, there was the Tier 3 which was set to be introduced, but then wasn't introduced because the government thought there'd be enough low-skilled workers within the EU to satisfy our demands. Obviously that was withdrawn, which leaves us in a bit of a hiatus. I mean, we can get workers in just now if they operate outside the 12, or the vessels operate wholly or mainly outside 12 miles. Currently, we can't get non-EA workers into vessels that operate within 12 miles. And as you'll see in the map I put in the submission there, that almost the entire west coast is within the 12 miles. So we have a section of the fleet that can't get access to non-EA crew at all, and they have difficulty getting access to EA crew because they don't want to work. So going forward for us, in terms of the catching sector, we would need something that's bespoke, that satisfies our needs. We're not a big sector, and it could be ring-fenced, and there could be security around that. But we do need something that is significantly different from what is currently in place.
I did have some follow-ups, but I think you've actually covered them both in your answers.
Can I just ask how this non-EEA business works in your fleet? I mean, like you describe it as a 12-mile rule that has to be abided, and you could recruit people as long as they don't cross the space into the 12-mile radius. Is that right? Yeah.
They are allowed to
how
come.
does that work, and how is that policed and operated?
Okay, so they're allowed to operate out with 12. They're allowed to come and go from port. The fishermen, the non-EA fishermen, are allowed to operate on the quayside and do nets, mend nets and various things, splicing or whatever, and go to the shops for goods. But they're not allowed to basically move around. That's for vessels operating wholly outside 12. Those that are operating inside 12 do not get access to crew. And indeed, those that have taken crew on board saying they're going to operate outside 12, if they're caught operating inside 12, then the men are sent home.
So that's what happened. You're sent home. And
They're just sent home. I mean, you should be aware that the centre that issues the visa applications is Manila. There's one centre that deals with the whole of the Far East now, and we visit there twice a year as well to try and iron out any problems we have with the embassy. But when a vessel applies for crew, it has to put forward an application. Within that application, there has to be 3 months vessel monitoring system, VMS data, spy stuff that shows where you've been for the last 3 months. And if you've been operating within 12 miles within that 3-month period, then you're just refused crew. It's as simple as that. So it's quite heavily policed.
It interests me because there's 2 categories of migrant worker that you have within the crews, and there is a means and a method to distinguish between these 2 groups, and there's appropriate sanctions that can be placed if any of these regulations or rules are broken. So what you actually have is a self-policing arrangement, practically.
Pretty much, but it is, for us, it's slightly ironic that if a vessel operates at 12.1 miles, he's within the law. If he operates at 11.98 miles and 99, he's breaking the law. And it just seems silly that you're talking about the same industry, the same pool of people that we want to bring in, yet there's that definition which makes one legal and one illegal. And there would seem to be no reason for it.
Really interesting. I suppose 12 miles is quite arbitrary. Is there any reason why 12 miles is a limit?
Currently, it's for territorial limits, but then the question has to beg that as you come out of Europe and your limit goes out to 200, what then happens?
Very good question. Thank you. David Ducat.
Thanks again. So we've already mentioned that the non-EEA crew members that work on vessels outside, or wholly or mainly outside the territorial waters of 12 miles, do not need a work visa. But are you aware of any Scottish fishing operations with crew members, non-EEA crew members, that do actually work with a work visa of some kind?
Not currently, I don't think. No.
Do you think there's a case, or there could be a case for making it possible for employers to engage non-EEA workers under some kind of work visa system?
I mean, I guess there's 2 or 3 sort of avenues you could go down, and any avenue that solves a problem we're willing to look at. I mean, in the past, in 2010, the SFF submitted a request to put fishing on the shortage occupation list. That was refused at that time because it wasn't highly enough skilled. So we're caught in a dilemma that we think the men are skilled, but they don't have the qualifications to show they're skilled. So it's a bit of a bugger's muddle. It's just we're caught in the middle, and we don't know what to do next, other than some major shift in terms of immigration and migration policy.
And I guess a question for both of you: if this idea of being able to come and work, essentially, I mean, coming through our borders and work, although working out with our territorial waters, do you think there might be any other situations where there's a recognised skills shortage where we could use a similar system? As if we could somehow manage people staying in that location?
From my perspective, I think there could be, because there are, as I've already outlined, a set of skills shortages that are generic to the food production industry. I suppose the thing I would be concerned against, and I guess listening to Mike, is the complexity of that and the perversity that sometimes is drawn into that, and that makes it difficult for individuals to police themselves, and it makes it difficult for businesses if they have the responsibility for policing those individuals. And when you're talking about in Scotland, maybe 30 to 40,000 people working in food and drink manufacturing, agriculture and fishing who are from the European Union, that's a significant issue for businesses to have to deal with. And if it's anything like the complexity that we've just heard, then it's not something would be sensible, I don't think.
Okay.
Could I just perhaps add that our Irish colleagues, we've still to set up this system, but our Irish colleagues have logged opportunities, fishing opportunities in Northern Ireland on the Euro portal, EURES, to try and get fishermen in. And in 3 months, they have 4 applications. 4 applications. So Tier 3 was done away with on the basis that there was enough low-skilled labour in Europe to satisfy the fishing industry's problem. That's obviously not the case. I mean, we're a way to create it in Scotland as well. It's just taken us some time. But it's obviously not the case that that pool of workforce is out there. So what we need is some solution that recognises that and recognises that that pool of labour is elsewhere. And the current rules do not satisfy us in terms of managing to access that in a legal way.
Thank you.
Thank you. John Marriott.
The latest migration figures show that since the EU referendum in 2016, there's been increased outward migration of EU nationals from the UK and a decrease in inward migration. I just wondered how that has impacted on your respective sectors and whether you're aware of a shortage of labour as a consequence of that.
Yes, it has had an impact, yes. We are aware anecdotally of impacts on labour force. We already have an issue where Skills Development Scotland estimate that in Scotland alone there's 27,000 job openings over the next 10 years in the food and drink industry. So there was already enormous pressure. And what this has done has meant that the people are reporting that, yes, people are leaving. People are reporting that it's getting harder to bring people in because the economics don't work, as well as whatever people think of the UK because of the devaluation of the pound. Then the economics don't work for a lot of people coming here, and so that will have an impact. It is having an impact now, but it will certainly have an impact in particular on agriculture in the next year, we would imagine. It is having a major impact just now.
I mean, I guess we are such a small sector that it's not something we've monitored, but my inclination would be to suggest that it probably doesn't affect us, given that, we are sourcing non-EA crew, and it's not the shift out of home people that cause us the problem, to be fair. Not in our communities, anyway.
Okay. And in terms of the agreement that appears to have been reached between the UK and the EU about EU nationals being able to stay here and vice versa, UK nationals in the EU being able to stay post-Brexit, does that reassure you, and do you think it'll address the problem in part?
It's greatly welcomed. It's something that we've called for since day one after the referendum. So that's really, really useful. If it pans out in the way that it's been suggested, there seems to be suggestion, we've had some information that it will be a bit like a passport application for individuals, and the costs will be about the same, all of which is still quite expensive. But giving some surety to the EU staff who are already here, I think, will be an enormous help. It doesn't solve what happens now, though. It doesn't solve what the future migration policy is. It doesn't solve how workers come in the future. So it's an enormously positive next step, not just for the people who it affects, but as part of the deal to move to the next stage. So both of those are really, really important to us, but it doesn't solve a future migration policy that will meet the needs of the sector.
Okay, thank you.
And in terms of the show sector that we're connected to, I mean, obviously it's a good development for them. If it comes to fruition in the way we think it will, then it's certainly a positive.
Okay, thanks.
Is there any reason why you're sensing people are leaving your particular occupations? I mean, is there anything anecdotally you picked up about why you feel that people are, with the guarantees and assurances they've got about residency? I mean,
well, there's a huge range of things. The residency thing isn't finished now yet, and despite the agreement, but that spent a year and a half with people unsure of their residency. So that uncertainty didn't help. The fall in the value of the pound has had a major effect on whether it's worth sending money back to whatever country you come from or not, and has shortened agricultural labour seasons. So we know that people are staying for seasonal workers, are spending less time in the UK and going to other parts of Europe where they can earn more money in specific seasons. There must be an element of people feeling welcome or unwelcome as well as part of that, particularly in the UK as a whole. So there's a whole range of different things. And Mike said something about labour within the EU as well. And I was speaking to a major Scottish company last week, and they're saying even within the EU, for a range of these reasons, they're having to go further and further away from the cities to find agricultural labour in Poland and other places. And even in the past 10 years, we've seen a move from Eastern European workers coming across to Southern European workers coming across and working. So there's a whole range of dynamics going on there.
I mean, I've hosted a couple of meetings in my constituency with EU nationals, and we've been able to identify, bring them together and just talk through, reassure, where possible, address concerns where necessary. And there is a strong sense, and these are people who work in a whole range of occupations, probably quite a lot of youth sectors,
Yes,
Mr Thompson, who feel that just the general atmosphere and culture that's developed because of the Brexit conversations has been a massive deterrent for them, like, with a view to stay in the UK. I mean, is that something that you've found at all?
Yeah, I mean, we are. I mean, again, anecdotally, but we are hearing that people are occasionally being confronted. Not necessarily in Scotland, these anecdotes, but yeah, people just feel less welcome here than perhaps they did a couple of years ago. Definitely.
Is there anything that you could do within your sectors which would encourage people to stay? Or?
Well, we are trying very, very hard. What we have from day one, we have put the needs of the workers in the sector as our number one issue. It's the first thing we've called for was surety about EU citizens, and it's been the first thing that we've always talked about. So hopefully from the leadership of those companies, they're saying that. We've also worked with companies to make sure they're aware of the rules that are in place, to make sure they're communicating with their staff, to make sure that they're applying for whatever they need to do through the process as well. So we've tried to make sure that companies are up to date as possible with that, and I've been encouraging them very much to give positive messages to their staff who make our food.
Thank you. David Duckett.
Thank you, Chair. As you mentioned yourself, Mr Thompson, the UK government provided, along with the EU side of negotiation, some kind of assurance
Yes.
or some kind of guarantee for those people settled, EU nationals settled in the UK. But the UK government has yet to set out what immigration it wants to see for the ongoing migration of EU nationals post-Brexit. What arrangements on that basis would you like to see? Well,
really we'd like to see as close to what we've got as is possible, because it works for us, as I've said. We've been asked for comment by the Migration Advisory Committee. We've supplied that both on a Scottish or we're supplying that both on a Scottish and UK basis. And essentially we need to wait to see what they're going to say early in the new year, dependent on that. But for us, actually quite a lot of what we have just now works. And so anything that is low cost and low maintenance for both businesses and people is really what we're aiming for, which is why I said earlier that the current third country status is probably something that's going to be too complicated for businesses.
And Mr Park, the Scottish Fishermen's Federation has called, as you mentioned earlier, for the Tier 3 points-based immigration system to be opened up again. How would you expect the conditions relating to Tier 2 visas, such as the skills immigration charge, resident labour market test and minimum salaries, to apply to Tier 3 visas?
I think ILO 188 is coming in, which is an internationally recognisable sort of regulation which the industry will have to set its standards by anyway. So anything in the future is going to be aligned to that international standard, which should satisfy all that. But there are further complexities in all of this in terms of the fishing industry. We're almost unique. Everybody else talks about losing their workforce in its EEA. I don't know for sure, but I guess we're one of the only sectors in the UK that depends or is semi-dependent on non-EEA labour. And you look at, for instance, just now, the inside 12 sector can only get access to EEA labour. Okay, they can't get access to the non-EEA because they're operating inside the 12. If we have a situation post-Brexit whereby the EEA become non-EEA, our inside 12-mile fleet will not get access to any other labour because they'll be ruled out completely. But I think we can do many things to the new regulation coming in terms of trying to satisfy our needs. We could liberalise Tier 2, we could certainly do that, or we could put in a new Tier 3, which was in there for a reason to start with, wasn't used and was subsequently withdrawn. Because there has to be a recognition now that in terms of the fishing industry, there is not suitable amounts of experienced fishermen in the EEA in terms of outside the UK, and that's got to be taken on board. So we need something that satisfies our demands, and they're not big demands. We're not a big sector, so you would think it wouldn't be too difficult to create something bespoke to deliver our needs.
Just out of interest, what you might have this data to hand, it might just be off the top of your head, but what would you say is the average age of a fisherman a locally homegrown fisherman, if you like?
The average age of a fisherman is higher than you would think. I think it's coming down. Obviously, when you feed 31 17-year-olds into the system, it comes down slightly. But the average age of a fisherman is between 40 and 50 years old.
Okay, so that is coming down. So I think it was in its 50s.
It's coming down. I mean, I still view myself as young. I left the sector 7 years ago, and I'm 60. So, you know, there's a lot of people like me in there, still in there, because they need the young generation to come through. Because we are an industry, it's different from most industries. It's full of alpha males, and they work in the toughest of conditions. I mean, I couldn't even try to describe to you the conditions that in my life I've operated within, because it's out with the natural bounds of anyone's imagination. So it's a difficult industry, and we need to bring the people in young to bring it on. But the average age currently is higher, significantly higher than we would like it to be.
Would it be fair to say it's an industry? I mean, I come from a farming background, as you know, and I think it's the same sort of thing where you kind of need to be growing into it, or born into it even, but you need to grow into it. It's not something you can just come off the street and
it's something you need to grow into. I mean, I operated on vessels. I come from Stonehaven. They had a fishing fleet at that time. It doesn't anymore. But from the age of 9 to 14, every weekend I went out in the boats. That's what I did. My father, or no one in the family, went fishing before me. I was sick every weekend I went out. Now, you know, you've something inside you that puts yourself in that situation week after week after week. After the first 6 hours, I was okay. But that's the sort of thing that people have got to overcome. And, you know, you may think that sickness, but if you're doing that, and if you were going into the office every Monday morning and up until lunchtime every week you were being sick, you would think about a different profession, seriously.
It's just a little bit like politics there. Or maybe not. Tommy Shepherd.
Sorry, I'm still just trying to make sure I've got this significance of the territorial limit correct. So if somebody is on a boat that's working entirely beyond the 12-mile limit, what is the difference in the work documentation they need to have from somebody who is in a situation where they may be within the 12-mile limit?
There is no differentiation at all. Absolutely none.
So
the
you
deciding factor
need the same
is the
work
law.
visa to work either inside or outside?
No, you can get a transit visa to operate inside from the non-EA. You can't.
At all?
Unless there's a concession. In 2010, the UK government gave the fishing industry a concession for 2 years to get its act into order in terms of bringing people into the sector. It was extended further for a year. But we failed at that time because we couldn't attract them. And recently, those operating in the wind farm sector have been given a concession to employ non-EA crew within the 12-mile limit. But it depends on a concession from the regulation.
So if you're from a non-EEA country, you can only get a work visa to work beyond the 12-mile limit?
That's correct.
And is that a matter of Home Office policy or
It's a matter of
international regulation? Why is that?
It's Home Office policy. You have to operate mainly or wholly outside 12 miles.
So this, I mean, I'm intrigued in this too.
I'm glad because we've been intrigued
could they
for some
change
years.
that? I mean, could they change that by regulation to 50 miles? Is there any? Is it an act of Parliament or anything? Why
It's in the regulation, mainly or wholly outside territorial waters. Yeah. Now, is there a reason for it being there? I guess somebody at some point thought there was a reason for it being there. Can we recognise that reason? No, we can't. Because if you operate at 11.9, you're illegal. You operate at 12.1, you're legal. There would seem to be no rationale behind it at all. Okay. Other than this distinction of territorial, non-territorial.
Okay, but this is my constituency. There's a restaurant 100 yards away with people from non-EEA countries working in it on work visas. And they're able to get that to work in a restaurant in Edinburgh, but not to fish within 12 miles.
No, we can't do it, no. And I'm not entirely sure they can get it to work in a restaurant low-skilled either, to be fair.
Yeah. No, I mean, it's a very curious regulation. It seems like it's designed, it's a UK-designed policy, isn't it? Which is...
As I say, we got a concession in 2010 on the basis that we were to improve recruitment into the sector. But when you're not making money, there's a lot of negative press on your sector. It's very, very difficult to recruit. Now, we've recently asked for further concession because we've now started on that process of rebuilding the young coming into the sector. We've started that now. And some recognition of that, we've asked for that concession to be put back in place, bearing in mind the offshore wind farm sector has a concession just now to allow non-EA crew to operate with inside 12, but we've been refused on all occasions.
Okay, right. Thank you. Teacher Brock.
Thank you, Chair. This is for Mr Thompson, really. The Food and Drink Federation Scotland said there is a requirement for a clear understanding of the population and immigration needs for Scotland. I was wondering, what are your thoughts on how that might best be achieved then?
Sure. We said that because there are differences. There are differences in geography and differences in demographics in Scotland. My figure of about 30% overall working in food and drink manufacturing is actually across the UK. So I think what you'll find is that there are definite differences in Scotland. Huge amount of food manufacturing in the Central Belt, so that's probably less of an issue. But when we go in particular to the northeast and others, then there are different economic, social and geographical pressures there. And I think any future migration policy needs to understand those differences and maybe come up with ways of dealing with them in a bespoke arrangement if necessary. Obviously, I've spoken a lot about simplicity, and anything that's bespoke reduces simplicity. But I think there will be enormous pressure in some of the geographical areas of Scotland, and there is food manufacturing of some sort in most parts of Scotland.
Right, so better data collection on the ground, really, I suppose, is what you're saying, to reflect the different
and
regions
the need
of Scotland's needs.
Yeah, that's right, and the need for that to be reflected in policy and legislation going forward.
Right, okay. And you also said that a better understanding of Scotland's migration needs could feed into a revised Scottish shortage occupations list. We have heard some criticism of that list up to now, so I'm just wondering how, in your view, might that be improved? It seems fairly inflexible, as one of the criticisms anyway, to this point.
And I think we've heard some of the issues with that. So what we would need, I think, is the shortage occupations list and the work that's done to understand business needs, to be modelled in a different way, to be much more reactive to business needs, and from our point of view, to try and link into key sectors which can deliver growth, and the food and drink industry is one of those.
Yeah, Mr Park, you mentioned skilled fishermen, or fisher folk. Their abilities not really being taken into account because they're don't have degrees or don't have any sort of professional qualifications, if you like. Is that one of the things that might make it difficult to get their profession onto that list? Is that something you've experienced?
It is, yeah. I mean, when we submitted our paper in 2010 to the MAC, it became clear then that they required an SQV level higher than we have in place. And whether something is skilled or non-skilled is up to the determination of the individual looking on, I guess. But you just can't step aboard a vessel and mend a torn net within 1 week. No. It takes years to learn that skill. Splicing wire, splicing rope takes years to learn that skills. In any modern vessel now, we have between 14 and 16 computers facing you all the time. It takes time to get to grips with that as well. Okay. So it is a relatively skilled job, but that's not taken on board. So it tends to be that we're still viewed as a very low-skilled industry.
Well, I mean, it seems pretty obvious to me that you require a high degree of skill to be able to go out in fishery boats and survive. So you're basically saying you've made representations to MAC, but they're not prepared to take that on board, because there have also been criticisms of MAC for that very reason, in that they don't appear to be listening to the differing requirements, certainly from Scotland, that the representations that have been made to them so far.
We presented in 2010 to the MAC. We've recently submitted another paper in terms of the call by Amber Rudd for evidence from the MAC. We've submitted to that. Okay. We've met with various immigration ministers over the last 2 to 3 years, putting forward our case. And on each occasion, we were basically told to go away.
Okay. Mr Thompson, is that your experience?
Well, we have not had much chance or need to engage with the MAC until this date, because if you were an EU national, we didn't need to worry so much about that. So, so actually, we've submitted in good faith to the Migration Advisory Committee, and we'll see what they say.
Okay. Leading on from that, really, there's been quite a lot of discussion about the need for some sort of differentiation within the immigration system to specifically meet Scotland's requirements. What do you think would make the case for that, and how might you envisage some of the... I mean, I think you've touched on a couple of points, the Tier 3 requirement, for example, but what are your views on that?
As I said, we still need to see what they say, but for me, it is about flexibility. It's about the ability to understand not just sectors where it's viewed as skilled or unskilled, but sectors which need people to grow. And actually, you know, the food and drink industry in Scotland's ambition to grow to 30 billion turnover by 2030 is going to need people to do the work. And without that influx of people to do the work to meet those 27,000 job vacancies in the next 10 years, then we're going to struggle to meet that ambitious target.
I mean, as a nation state, we depend on foreign workers. I mean, I think you travel down the west of Scotland through the hotels there, you realise how dependent we are on it. You go into the sort of processing factories up in the northeast of Scotland, we see how dependent we are on foreign labour. And I think whatever we do in terms of being a nation state, we should be put in something that's quite liberal and allows a natural flow of the required workforce.
So there's quite a lot of subnational. Dr. Eve Hepburn produced a paper looking at subnational solutions for different countries: Switzerland, Finland, Australia, and Canada, two that are obviously mentioned a lot. So it's something like that that specifically looks at the requirements, say, of rural West Coast Scotland and
or of specific professions.
So some sort of flexibility within that would not be unwelcome.
If I, sorry, on your comment.
I mean, all we ask is for the industry to be looked upon as something different, and it requires a solution to a problem that we in particular face.
Yeah.
So I think that's all that we require and request.
Okay.
But there are, and just to build on that, there are, you know, specific things where we can see pinch points just now. So in order to sell meat and send meat abroad, you need an official veterinarian from the Food Standards Scotland. 98% of those are from the European Union.
Thank you.
Always told that we did an inquiry in population demography, which I think you helped us with, Mr. Thompson, in the last session of Parliament. And the UK government always say that, you know, your issues are common across the United Kingdom. You know, the issues to do with fisheries there's nothing different. Peterhead and Grimsby, and you know, in the food sector, it's very much the same as Perthshire than it would be in Penzance. Is there anything which is significantly different about your sectors, you know, in a Scottish context, in comparison with what happens across the rest of the United Kingdom?
I think from my perspective, there's a couple of things to say there. The first is that food and drink is much more important to Scotland's economy than it is to the rest of the UK economy. It's still really, really important to the UK economy, but I'm not sure that's quite recognised in the same way as it is in Scotland. So we're one of the key sectors. We're, I think, the top manufacturing sector in the past couple of years. So for us, that's much more important nationally than it might be, and actually it should be in the rest of the UK. The other thing to say is, if that was a UK official or coming from the UK government, it doesn't really recognise the need for regional solutions within England either, does it? And so actually there may be differentiation in parts of England that are as much deserving of the argument as in Scotland.
The particular aspect of the sector that differentiates us from the rest of the UK, other than Northern Ireland, is the fact that, you know, we talk about agribusiness. Well, up in Scotland you have the fish business, which is the top end in terms of size of vessels, number of men aboard vessels. You go down to England, the majority of their fleet is one-man bands, beach boats, whatever, and you don't have the same dependency on foreign crew or non-UK crew because they are the crew. And that's why up in Scotland and indeed Northern Ireland, we are set aside from the rest of the UK. And there are obviously regional differences in that.
And again, listening to the Minister when I was driving in today, there seemed to be a sense that a subnational immigration policy isn't something that they're actively considering just now. And this belief that across the UK, all sectors experience the same sort of difficulties, and also the idea that, you know, I mean, the immigration figures and numbers is the key driver and priority when it comes to immigration policy. Is there any examples that you could have, or any issues where people come into your sectors who, like, whatever, you know, like, it's probably for Mr. Park, but I'd find it difficult to figure out how this would work, given they're off 12 miles off the shore, where, you know, like, people who come into your professions slip into the general economy and are lost to the authorities.
We have had occasions in the past where some non-EA crew have actually, you know, went away to London or whatever. That's very, very far and few between. By and large, the people coming into the sector are here to make money and work and send that money home. We visit the families. I particularly visit the families twice a year, go down to Cebu Island, one village, 39 houses, 37 of the husbands operate out of Peterhead and Fraserburgh. And you get that sort of, interlinked commitment from them. So very rarely will that happen. And I would suggest in the future it's not going to happen either. So it becomes a very bespoke industry within a bespoke sort of regulatory system, or indeed that's what we would hope it was.
And certainly from us, yes, there is turnover, and nobody has asked us to track people, really, have they? So so that's possible. But I mean, there are possibilities there. National insurance numbers or others should be an easy enough way to do that. And it's actually done in Europe, in countries in Europe anyway. It's just the UK has been, I understand, quite lax in tracking people. So there are opportunities to do it.
Grateful. Well, thank you both ever so much for getting this kicked off this morning. And if there's anything further that you observe and anything further you've got to usefully contribute to this inquiry, please get in touch, and we'll be quite happy to take any further submissions. But thank you very much.
Thank you very much.
Thank you. Have our next guest, please. Good morning to you both. Just for the record, who you are, what organisations you represent, and anything by way of a short introductory statement. We'll start with you, Mr. Dr. McCaskill.
I'm Donald McCaskill. I work for an organisation called Scottish Care. Scottish Care represents the independent care sector. That's the voluntary, charitable and for-profit social care sector in Scotland. Our members employ just over 100,000, so that's half of the 1 in 13 Scots who work in social care.
Thank you. Ms. Rogers.
Good morning. My name is Shelley Rogers. I'm Director with responsibility for workforce and strategy for Scotland's Health Service. So I have policy responsibility for all of those matters as they pertain in Scotland's 22 boards, and we employ about 156,000 people.
Grateful for that. We'll just get things kicked off. Could you perhaps describe and tell the committee just how important non-UK workers are to your respective professions, and what's the proportion of non-UK workers that you have within your sectors?
If the committee's happy for me to start, the importance of our EU workforce is significant. In number terms, you'll have seen about 5-6% of our doctors, 4% of our nurses in training, 2% of our dentists come from an EU background. Perhaps some things that are not as evident that the committee might be interested in pursuing. We have quite a strong correlation between where professions train and where they go on to practice. So one of the things that is of concern for us at the moment is the reduction in numbers of people seeking to train in Scotland. There's quite a high correlation between if you train at a particular medical school, you are more likely to go on and practice in that location. Or if you train at a particular nursing school, that's also the case. And I think the other theme, having sat and listened to the very comprehensive evidence from the two previous speakers, was the issue about messaging and attractiveness. We operate very much, particularly for our high-end specialties, we operate very much in an international market. So it's not just about how easy we make it for people to come and study and practice here. It's about all of that messaging that says how welcome and how attractive people are in a world where they can just as readily go and practice medicine in Australia, Canada, or anywhere else.
And just is that something that you've noted and observed in the course of the past couple of years since this conversation about leaving the European Union started?
The RCN gave evidence last year around nursing numbers and identified a 96% decline in the number of people seeking to come and train.
96%?
96% decline. In medical schools, the evidence is still a little more anecdotal than that. But we are now having all 5 of Scotland's medical schools start to advise us that they are seeing a drop-off in the expressions of interest from candidates coming from EU nations.
What sort of impact will this have in the sector if we're seeing drop-off rates of that?
So, unmitigated, obviously that would be quite significant. I mean, we are spending a lot of time trying to mitigate for that in terms of increasing the numbers of places at Scottish medical schools, working very hard to increase access to Scots students going into Scottish medical schools, and all of the other things that you would expect us to be doing to try and mitigate for that. The issue for us, of course, is that medical education is an extremely long pipeline. So getting 5 years at medical school, a couple of years of foundation training, and then potentially 10 years of specialty training mean that is a very long time from flash to bang in order to get some of the very high-end specialties that we need to attract. And those high-end specialties are needing to be attracted across the world. So we're doing that in the context of the rest of the world being very welcoming to medical students and to medics from whatever specialty. But in some of our harder to recruit specialties, that is quite challenging.
Beautiful. Dr. McCaskill, what about your sector?
It's extremely similar in terms, so if I can take it in two, so in terms of care homes, we have approximately 68% of care home nursing, social care nurses, come from the EEA, and a significant percentage of about 6% from out with Europe. In terms of social care, that would be social care staff, both in care homes and in care at home organisations. The percentages in terms of European individuals would be about 6%, and in terms of care at home and housing support, that jumps to about 8.9%. So a sizable percentage of the current workforce comes from the EEA.
Is there any particular reason why, like, particular care home and social care sector is so dependent on migrant labour?
There are lots of reasons. Some of them are historical and cultural. So one of the largest providers of social care in Scotland historically have been religious communities who have tended to recruit, particularly nursing, from out with Europe. More recently, the increase in demographics, the increased demand of the nature of dependency within care homes. Care homes effectively in the last 3 or 4 years, 5 years, have become mini cottage hospitals, and care at home organisations are delivering high-level clinical skill in the communities. So as dependency and demand and skill base has increased, we've not been able to recruit within Scotland. Despite positive interventions like the introduction of the Scottish Living Wage, that has effectively just increased the bar, because the average care worker in Scotland today is employed at £8.45. In this city, in fact, in this constituency, a major retailer is advertising directly targeting care staff for £14.95 starting salary. So faced with that reality, it's been challenging. Now, care is costly, emotionally, physically, and it carries strictly regulated requirements. It carries a qualification requirement, a registration requirement. So if you're faced with the prospect of working in a sector where none of that exists in terms of the regulatory and registration requirements, and getting effectively a third more money, or in a care sector, then it's maybe not inevitable that we have had a real challenge in the last decade of recruiting sufficient home-based workers to supply the high level and high quality care that we need and require. And our fear, our profound fear, is that now that we are in the process of already seeing the tap being turned off, where is that workforce going to come from, and where are we going to get the people needed to care?
Paul, did you want to?
Yeah, just a supplement, if I could, in relation to those professions where you're coming out of a university route, either through nursing or through medical school, for example. When you're talking about the drop-down in places being taken up by EU nationals, are those then being filled from within Scotland? Or are you saying that those are places that are medical schools that are unfulfilled?
No, every effort is made to fill those places in Scotland, but of course the challenge is that we want to have the same quality and calibre. So it isn't simply, anybody can turn up. That we're working very hard with schools and with the medical schools to make sure that we've got an ample supply of applicants into those places. So we're not at the moment experiencing challenges where the universities are running with incomplete courses. However, the kind of drop-off, particularly in nursing and particularly in our high-end training programs. Because remember that we are committed to having the very best healthcare system for Scotland, and that requires us to be able to go out and offer clinical academic posts, all sorts of high-end specialty training posts to encourage the best of the best to come and practice their medicine in Scotland. But we're not at the moment seeing universities running with empty places in medicine.
So do you have concerns that could potentially happen, and is that as a result of people either not being attracted into those careers or simply not leaving school with the qualifications or skills to then come in and fill those places up?
There are challenges about people having the opportunity to study all of the things that they need to study. We're just about to launch our first postgraduate medical degree in Scotland, which will open the next academic year. That will allow people who've previously trained in other disciplines to train in medicine in Scotland. But it's really about trying to make sure that access is available for as many people who are able to go to medical school, and then we're able to offer the most attractive employment for them thereafter. Because training people is one thing, retaining them in an attractive way is another thing.
I'm looking at the retention figures for your sector, Dr. McCaskill, and I'm seeing a figure of 22%. Is that roughly right?
Yep.
And so, as well as the recruitment, the retention-related issues are obviously a major challenge and difficulty for both your sectors, I imagine. And I was going to ask both of you just about what you're doing to try and recruit Indigenous population to consider working in both your professions. But I think you've got a sense of that from Dr. McCaskill about the competition that seems to be out there in the marketplace for people have a variety of options. And again, hearing about, is there anything more that you think you could do, or you're speaking to a bunch of politicians here, is there anything that we could design to help you in order to try and ensure that you could do better in terms of recruitment locally?
You will be aware that the Health and Social Care Workforce Part 2 plan was published last Friday by Scottish Government, and a lot of stakeholders have been asking that question in the last calendar year. How are we going to address some of the workforce challenges? One of the elements that plan contains, it contains 7 recommendations, is that we need to undertake a major public awareness campaign around the importance, significance and contribution of social care to the fabric of our society, because there is a real challenge that at the moment, however much we would pay carers, we are not getting people through the door. So in order to compete in this city with dog walking, which is now paying more than caring for a human being, according to local research that was done in Edinburgh, organisations are going above and beyond to incentivise care, but even then they're having difficulties with people coming through the front door. So there's a bigger picture question here about creating a culture which is appreciative of care. And we're also faced with the reality, as previous speakers have noted, that we are getting a smaller and smaller pool of individuals from which to recruit. One academic has recently said that every single school leaver in Scotland at the present rate would have to go into social care unless we are able to continue to recruit from outside this country.
We did a bit of work in population demography in the last session of Parliament. One of the things that we recognised and reported was what we call the dependency ratio, where the amount of available labour to supply and sustain particular occupations like yourself was an issue for Scotland. Is that something that concerns you, or something that you've noted in terms of your ability to recruit? Absolutely.
I mean, Donald's just made reference to the Part 2 of the National Health and Social Care Workforce Plan, which incorporates health and social care. If we take the widest aspects of health and social care, we estimate that about 400,000 people across Scotland, either through the NHS, through local government or through the kinds of organisations that Donald represents, work in health and social care. That's a fairly whopping proportion of the working population of Scotland. So broadly, 1.5 out of every 10 kids at school at the moment has got to be interested in health and social care in order for us to be sustainable at our current levels. So there's a huge amount of effort going on to try and make those jobs as attractive as they can be. So Donald mentioned earlier on comparisons with what might be perceived as easier work around walking dogs and working in different places. One of the features of the health service is that it is a 24/7 operation. And it has to be for obvious reasons. So, that's just the nature of our business. So things like flexible working become terribly important. And the efforts that we're able to do around flexible working are important. The NHS in Scotland has given long-term assurances over its workforce in the areas, for example, of no compulsory redundancies in the NHS. So there's a security thing which is very important. We place a very high premium on the training experience of people who obviously do some of their clinical stuff in universities and then come out into the system to continue that training. There is a good deal of evidence and a lot of work audited from GMC and MMC and various others around the quality of the training experience and the impact that has on the attractiveness of the roles. We're working very hard with our colleagues in education at the moment to look at the school's curricula and to try and ensure that people at school are excited by the prospect of working in health and social care. And that's quite challenging because, the front pages of our newspapers are not always the most attractive narrative about what working in public services and in the health services is always like. And then finally, we're also recognising that we've got to be grown up. So people do leave us from time to time, and we've got to make it as easy as possible for them to come back. So when you're talking about assurance, just as a small amount of humour, I was talking to a junior doctor only a few weeks ago who had a picture of the Royal Alexander in Paisley in the rain and a picture of the A&E receiving unit in Melbourne, and he's in the sunshine, and said, which one would you pick, Joe? So which, if you're young and you're able to be mobile and move wherever you want to go and you don't have dependents, and all that, it's great to go and have an experience. And then the knack, I think, for us is being attractive so that people want to come back.
In fact, Chair, given that you gave me an opportunity to recommend something to politicians, and that's very rarely offered to me, the one thing I think we could do is to start talking up social care in particular and see social care as, rather than a drain on communities and societies and the economy, rather to see social care as an economic driver and as a contributor, just like the Welsh Government has recently undertaken. So that would entail, from the social care perspective, seeing social care as an enterprise worthy of investment rather than the narrative which we often hear, which is an increased demographic and need is draining and costing society. The fact that we have 100,000 social care workers providing support means that they're contributing to their community. But it also means that they're enabling family members, the son to go out to work, the daughter, the sister, the brother. And that is of a massive economic benefit. So I think what we can all of us do, and might I suggest the politicians can take the lead, is start talking up social care and health as contributor rather than as drain.
Grateful for that. Ross Thompson.
Thank you very much, Chair. Mr McCaskill, the Chair mentioned in an earlier question that 22% figure of annual turnover in the care home sector. I was wondering if you were aware of any data which shows turnover by nationality to show whether or not EU or non-EU citizens are likely to stay in jobs in this sector for a longer or shorter period of time than UK nationals.
We don't have that level of sophisticated data. The Scottish Government has just commissioned Ipsos Mori to undertake a bit of work. The care home retention rate is 22%. It's 33% in the care at home and housing support sector, so it's significantly worse. We are hearing, however, anecdotally, and have since probably accelerated in the last calendar year, that more and more individuals faced, as has already been presented, with the economic reality that it is now probably more profitable to work back at home than in Scotland. We are hearing anecdotally of a significant number who are leaving both the care home sector and the care at home sector. And for us and for our members, Brexit isn't something we're waiting to happen, it's already starting.
Just out of interest, that you said Ipsos and Mori have been commissioned to do research. Just a bit more information. What sort of research is that? When do you think it's likely to come?
Scottish Government colleagues will probably be able to answer more fully, but Ipsos Mori have been commissioned to undertake a degree of analysis, and indeed the social services paper which you have in front of you makes reference to this research, specifically to look at the number of EU individuals working in social care and the extent of that work and the roles that they do. Again, all our research is on a voluntary basis. Individuals don't have to communicate data and information. And there's a real sensitivity, not least with some of the political narrative last year, around how that data might be used. So our desire to retain workers includes our desire not to overly identify them in a manner which might be not constructive.
Yeah, thanks, panel. And something I think every panel is about how you find the impact of the conflict between this largely unrestrictive policy around EU nationals compared to the very restrictive position for individuals outside of the EU, and whether that causes you issues, and particularly, I suppose, moving forward, whether or not if future migration policy around Brexit allows a more level playing field and making it easier for individuals outside the EU to come and work in the UK, whether that's something that could be a benefit.
I go back to my point about attractiveness, and whatever arrangement is put into play needs to send a signal that says these people are welcome into the UK, welcome into Scotland. So anything that is as light touch as can be made.
So could you speak up a little?
Sorry, I beg your pardon. I was talking about the attractiveness of the process, and saying that anything that is as light touch and as simple as can be made, so that people feel that they're welcome and that their contribution is welcome, at a time when we know that lots of other nations in lots of other parts of the world are also looking to recruit those same people.
And it would be very similar in the sense we've got two experiences in social care. One is our existing experience with the MAC process. Scottish Care has made numerous attempts to have social care, and particularly social care nursing, recognised as a distinctive category under the tier system, unsuccessfully, and it does beg and we've added to the submission of colleagues and our own submission to MAC again this year, and we are getting to the stage at which the failure of MAC to identify and recognise that there are distinctive skill shortages in Scotland is leading us to conclude, well, why bother asking us? Because you're not listening to what we're saying to you. So, for instance, we have real geographical challenges in terms of social care recruitment. We have real skills shortages with regards to specific areas, both in terms of care home nursing and indeed in the delivery of care at home. So our experience thus far with the system for care home providers who have used MAC as a route to attract non-EU nurses has not been positive. And therefore we are considerably concerned that if such points-based, inflexible, overly bureaucratic and extremely complex system is introduced, then the whole sector will have real difficulty. Over 95%, I think the Scottish FBA has already communicated to you, of businesses have had no experience of recruiting from out with Europe. The vast majority of care home providers in Scotland and care at home organisations have had no experience, and the majority are singleton care homes and family-run businesses. So they fall very much into the category of organisations that don't have an HR system, don't have robust financial, I shouldn't say robust, have sufficiently robust but not able to be extended to deal with this category of work. And quite frankly, a 209-page document, which is the guidance document, is pretty incomprehensible.
Jed Killen.
Thank you, Chair. There are several jobs in the health sector which are included in the skills shortage list for the UK and Scotland. How much easier does that make it for the health sector to employ non-EU nationals under the Tier 2 visa?
We have had some success in being able to add particular areas into the shortage occupation list, as you identify. But the reason that they're a shortage occupation list is because there's a shortage of them. So I go back to my position around international recruitment and the international attractiveness of these individuals. The other thing that I think it's really important that the health service evidence gives some expression to is that whilst we are very attracted to recruiting high-end specialties, our supply pipeline also relies very heavily on us being able to recruit young people and train our own. So healthcare support workers that operate within the NHS and a whole raft of other people who come to work in the NHS start out from school, or start out from modern apprentices, or start out from a whole range of different earn-as-you-learn type schemes that mean that whilst a points-based system that is helpful for us in recruiting at that very top end, so long as it's not unduly bureaucratic or cumbersome, is very useful and valuable. It is also the case that we need the supply pipeline in a very similar way to the way that Donald does. And that point about parity of esteem, I think, is really important, that we don't lose sight of that. The other thing I would say about recruiting from outside the European Union, the NHS 20 or 30 years ago recruited very heavily from places like the Indian subcontinent and others. The rules around that have obviously been tightened. There's also some economic reasons why we don't get as many applicants from there as from those parts of the world as we used to, as they have become wealthier themselves. Then you don't have to ship your bright young medics over to the UK to practice. But also, we are quite committed to ethical recruitment. You know, we want to have a good supply chain within the NHS in Scotland, of course we do. But we also recognise that actually there are some parts of the world that are significantly worse off in terms of their healthcare. So we've tried to address that by creating training opportunities. So we have training fellowships in Scotland that allow people to come from overseas more widely than the European Union, train here or have an element of their training here, practice for us whilst they're here on that enhanced training, and then go back better equipped. So it's a mixture of there isn't a solution that if we just have that tick there, we'll get the workforce that we need. It's about making sure that we have enough investment in all of the things that we need to do to try and give us the however many hundreds of different specialties the NHS needs in order to survive.
I think Dr McCaskill answered the question I was going to ask.
I'm just having a look at the shortage occupation list in your sector, and we see nurses are included, medical consultants, emergency practitioners, radiographers, neurophysiologists and paramedics. It's quite a list, isn't it? You know, I mean, what more do you feel you actually need on that list in order to try and ensure that you have availability staff?
It's not so much widening the categories. I mean, there are vacancies that occur from time to time in any of the specialties. It's not so much widening the categories. It really is about this issue of to what extent have we got a process that is easy for people to do. So the translation of a Tier 2 training visa into a visa to allow people to come back and practice, for example, it is clunkier than it needs to be in my view. It's not about let's have a list of 5,000 things. It's about let's have a signpost that says we're open and welcoming and want people to come here in a way that I worry at the moment. If I think about my postbag of EU citizens writing to me and corresponding with me and tweeting me and various other things over the last year, it's really looking for assurance. These are not just workers, and the committee is wise enough to know that. These are people who've chosen to make their homes here and to build their lives here and to have children here and invest in their communities. So Donald was talking earlier on about the community aspects of social care. In a lot of parts of our country, people have really invested not just themselves, but their partners, their families, and a whole raft of other things. So anything that puts a question mark over that.
I just want to stay on the shortage occupationalists just now, if we can. And
Sorry, I beg your pardon.
noted your frustration, Dr. McCaskill, where you said you made repeated representations to the MAC in order to try and ensure that, you know, like their further categories are included. I mean, I'm seeing that you've called for social care nurses for care homes to be placed in the shortage occupationalists, but aren't they already on it? And is there any special dispensation in Scotland for social care nurses?
The committee will know from our evidence that we're facing a 31% current vacancy level in social care nursing in Scotland, which is really critical. And technically, it is possible to get a nurse through the general nursing route of the shortage occupation route. But what we had been asking for is a degree of what is technically called bonding, which enables an individual to be bonded to a particular area of responsibility for a particular period of time to identify and to address a particular challenge, which in our case is the distinctive shortage of nurses to work in a care home environment. And that was the particular request which was turned down. It's something which the Chief Nursing Officer has been looking at in terms of prioritising or incentivising, and bonding suggests a fairly negative image. So was there a mechanism by which one can incentivise a nurse, either within Scotland, but in this context of discussion from out with?
Can I just explore just a little bit more just the process of applying to MAC in order to try and make these representations? I mean, are you supported by them? Do they come and speak to you about what's required? I mean, tell the committee just how this works. When you've identified a particular sector or category that you feel, you know, should get extra support, what do you do in order to try and ensure that happens?
We wouldn't ourselves go through the process, but our members would. So how, on their behalf, when they have reflected to us that it's becoming increasingly difficult, even within the present level of permission, to recruit nurses from out with Europe. And indeed, we've seen a 34% decrease since January this year on the current attempts to recruit. We've made representation to the MAC. We have sought meetings and have never ever been granted a meeting.
Never granted a meeting?
No.
Okay. Going forward, and we're looking at a new immigration system, and we'll be asking you questions about that later on in the session, but a lot of people have suggested that it might be the points-based system with an enhanced MAC. I mean, given your experience, I mean, like, what does that suggest to you that we might be in?
If the MAC process was more contextualised, more appreciative of geographical reality, more willing to be reciprocal rather than seen as a body whose primary role is to keep the numbers down and to say no, but in as polite terms as possible, if MAC transformed itself into an enabler of enterprise and a facilitator of migration rather than a block, then the care sector would very much look forward to working with such a body.
Okay, thank you. John Lamont.
Thank you, Chairman. My question was the same question I put before about the figures that show increased outward migration of EU nationals since the referendum 2 years ago, and I think you've sort of answered that already. But I just wanted to get an idea of the scale of the problem. What are the figures for non-international migration within the UK? How many people come to work in Scotland from Wales and England and Northern Ireland compared to EU nationals and non-EU nationals, particularly in the medical profession and nursing?
I don't have that instantly to hand. There has always been a fair amount of cross-border transfer in terms of training experiences, so it isn't atypical for a candidate leaving a Scottish medical school to go and have some of their training experience in a big teaching hospital down south or whatever. In most of our evidence would suggest that at some point they come back into Scotland at some point in their career.
I was thinking more the other way. Who are coming from England to the medical schools, for example, in Scotland, compared to the international component?
The English proportion is significantly bigger than the rest of the EU. So if we took a percentage, and the broad figures, if we took a percentage of those people studying in a Scottish medical school, it would be broadly 50 to 60% Scots, broadly 30% from the rest of the UK, and the rest will be from the rest of the world.
Okay.
Social care data merely records whether an individual is from the UK, not the country of origin or birth.
So if there was a separate or different or differential immigration policy for Scotland, do you foresee any challenges with that proportion of the UK migration to Scottish institutions to get training if there was a divergence?
It's hard to answer that in the abstract because I don't know what it would look like. But if it's something that makes it hard for the rest of the UK students to come into Scotland, then clearly that would be challenging. It would also be challenging to talk about something that was, so if you're wanting to practice in UK med school and you're coming from somewhere abroad, you know, sometimes there isn't that much of a differentiation between whether or not you want that to be Glasgow Med School or whether you want that to be a med school in London or in Birmingham. So it's got to have something that has a read across to make sense. But I wouldn't particularly want something that made it difficult for us to do internal UK transfers.
Because that would make the problem far, far worse.
Oh, as I say, it's difficult to answer that in the abstract. But potentially that difference might make for an additional bit of complication. The debate that you were having with the previous two witnesses, we were talking about a bespoke something, can sometimes is great if you've got that particular niche, but actually what you want is something that is broadly simple for people.
Okay. And my next question to Dr McCaskill, slightly off point. I mean, clearly this inquiry is about immigration, but social care budgets within the council sector, I mean, clearly that has an impact on how much people in your area get paid and the hourly rate compared to, I mean, you used a very good example of people being attracted into other sectors because of the higher rate of pay. But does the social care budgets within Scottish councils impact on or aggravate the problem which you have been describing to us so well this morning?
Obviously, the issue of recruitment and retention, the number one reason people say they don't want to work in social care is rates of pay and reward. The second is emotional stress and difficulty. So I have been fairly public in the last month of saying that we need to spend significantly more amounts of money in terms of the care of our most vulnerable citizens. But equally, I've been fairly public in saying that the local authorities in Scotland have managed, despite austerity, to retain funding to a considerable level. But we need more because we have greater demand, there's a growing dependency and an increasing population. And I'm sure were representatives of the Scottish Government here, they would be saying they have tried as hard as they can to keep the levels of funding as they are in face of Westminster austerity. So my challenge would be to the whole of the United Kingdom, what is the priority we're giving to social care funding? Whether it's England, Wales, Ireland or Northern Ireland, it's clearly insufficient.
Okay. Right, okay, thanks.
I'm just interested in what you said there, Ms Rogers, about your breakdown. You reckon 50% Scottish, 30% from the rest of the UK, then the 20% from non-EU, which, to be strikes to be quite impressive in terms of, you know, we're able obviously to attract people from the rest of the United Kingdom. Well, you know, a good number of that percentage proportion still coming from out with. I mean, like, every time we raise these issues, we're told by UK ministers we should be doing more to attract people from the rest of the United Kingdom to come to Scotland and make that more attractive. And there's a number of issues and reasons that are always put forward. Is there anything that, in your experience, that we could do to see what we could to attract more people to migrate to Scotland from the rest of the UK? This is for both of you, just your very different experiences.
I'm not sure I accept the premise that you are challenged with in those instances. Scotland has very highly regarded world-class medical schools who, you know, you don't, Edinburgh University Medical School does not struggle to get applicants. Similarly, Glasgow, and I now feel obliged to list the other three in case they feel. But Scotland's medical schools have a very high reputation across the world. Scotland, from the age of Scots Enlightenment, has a very strong reputation for medicine and for scientific discovery. We sit here in an institution that reflects that. Scotland's deemed to be innovative. It has innovative medical practices. It's also deemed to be a very welcoming society. And, you know, the experience of people who come to study in Scotland is very good. And they go home and tell people that. So I'm not complacent around that. I think we would always wish to support the universities to give the very best experience that they can. But actually, you know, in some respects, it would be better for me, if I was being entirely selfish around the NHS in Scotland, if we had fewer people from around the world and we trained lots of Scots that we retained to live and practice in Scotland. But we want the very best of the best. So the fact that people are attracted to come here from around the rest of the UK and around the rest of the world is actually a very attractive thing.
What about you, Dr.
Yeah, I mean, I chair quite a few UK-wide groups, and I continually highlight that we do social care differently in Scotland. This is a great place to come and care for others and be cared for. And the fact that we, on average, pay a support worker more than in the rest of the UK is itself positive. I would certainly be arguing that we should be rewarding people even more than we currently do. The fact that we have, in terms of quality of inspection and scrutiny, which is increasingly being looked with admiration by the rest of the United Kingdom. So my earlier answer about making social care as an economic priority and a driver might help, and would, I think, help Scotland place itself at the forefront of the delivery of person-centred, rights-based quality care. And I'd love to be in a situation of speaking to the rest of my United Kingdom colleagues in saying there is only one place if you want to develop yourself professionally, individually, to come and care, and that's Scotland. But at the moment, our profound concern is without Europe, Scotland will not be able to care.
Okay. Right. Well, that brings Tony Shepherd. Yeah.
Brings it nicely to my question now, which is, and the UK government is yet to say what immigration arrangements it will have for the EU 27 countries after 2019. Do you have a view on what they should be? And if the government were to have a situation where immigration from the European Union was as restrictive as it currently is with the rest of the world, what would be the implications of that for your sector?
Well, I want anybody who wants to be able to contribute to and live in and be professionally active in Scotland to have the chance to be able to come here. So for me, a migration policy that was purely points-based, I think, would be unfortunate. We need to be able to attract young people to come and live and work here who may not necessarily have all of the certification that is required for a points-based system. And I want that process to be as administratively easy as we can make it in a world where people can go and live in lots of places. And we want some of them to be able to come and live here. If we had something that was very restrictive, we've already talked a little bit about the quantum that we currently have working within the NHS in Scotland. My anxiety would be around the messaging that sends to people who want to come and train here and work here going forward. So those percentages will diminish. You know, if we've currently got 4% of our nursing cohort and we experience the kind of drop-off that the RCN were reporting last year, then that percentage figure is not sustainable. And until and unless we can find our own Indigenous population to fulfil those roles, then that will give us an operational difficulty. And I think Donald has already very eloquently described the process around nursing and the challenges that it gives us around nursing. I would go back to the evidence that I gave right at the beginning that says this is a very long supply pipeline for us. So, you know, if we wanted to have a larger number of doctors to make up for the deficit in EU doctors that might be available to us, we should have started the thinking about that 20 years ago. It takes a good 15 to 20 years to get me a consultant from school to practicing as a fully experienced consultant in the NHS. So, would we? I guess the other thing that I need to say is that medicine and the provision of healthcare services in Scotland have always been about giving the very best to the population. And some of those research posts in particular are about particular individuals or groups of individuals who have a high-end specialty that we want to be able to attract. So when we're going out shopping for cancer specialists or particular high-end specialists, we're looking at the very highest level of skill. And frankly, the nation that they were born is a second-order issue for me, as opposed to can they come and provide healthcare at the very best standard, or medical research or whatever it is at the very best standard for the people of Scotland. So anything that gives me a difficulty in doing that is always going to be suboptimal.
And my answer would be, following Shirley's, for care there are two real elements. One is relationship, and the second is probably hospitality and openness. For us as a sector, it is difficult to imagine an individual in the role of care without that relationship and that degree of openness on our part. And so an overtly points-based system which was too restrictive, inflexible, lacking in dynamic, unappreciative of geographical difference, and the fact that the nature of relationship means that people change their minds both ways, that system is not one that we would find appealing or acceptable. But at the moment, as Shirley says, we want the best. Anything that restricts us or prevents us from that possibility is bound to be counterproductive.
Yeah, well, we're still to see exactly what the UK have in mind, and we're all sort of trying to imagine what sort of immigration system they're going to design. But like what we're hearing is that if it's something which approaches like what we currently apply to non-EU nationals, it would present big difficulties for recruitment and retention.
If there is somebody around the world who has a treatment that could save lives in Scotland, I don't want to be in a position where we have such restrictive migration policies that we can't offer them a job.
Thank you.
And from our perspective, you know, if the majority of our businesses are small, single, family-run businesses, how are they going to cope with an overly complex, inaccessible, bureaucratic system? Because at the moment they're struggling with their time and energies to deliver care. That resource is needed there. It's not needed in going through really complex systems.
Grateful. Deidre.
Well, a lot of the questions I was going to ask have been asked, but it does seem to suggest that perhaps you would not... I mean, there's been quite a lot of discussion about a subnational approach to immigration for Scotland, and you'll know that the Scottish Government submitted quite a lot of data to MAC and so on recently. We've yet to hear how they'll respond, but is that something that you could see working? Because certainly, as I mentioned before, Dr. Hepburn's paper has looked at these options around the world. It seems to be something, particularly if you could reduce the complications of that system, as you mentioned, that it seems to be broadly welcomed by a lot of some sort of differentiated approach by a lot of the organisations we've had giving evidence so far. What are your thoughts on that?
I think there is an awful lot of that rings true in Dr. Hepburn's paper, and a differentiated system would certainly be a system which would be more flexible. I think personally, though we would need to see the nature of the differentiation, it is one not least with biometric technology which could be easily utilised. I think people, and certainly it's been our experience in the care sector, when they come to Scotland, they start their job, they'll very quickly bring partners or form relationships, they'll root themselves into their communities, and they don't want to go, and they don't want certainly to go into the hassle of potentially risking the security they have. So I think there is a lot to potentially commend itself with a differentiated system.
Okay.
I think so too. I think the bureaucratic point is worthy of exploration, and I think that the approach that would be taken between government to government and the context of the UK Parliament and the Scottish Parliament becomes quite interesting in that respect. And why do I say that? I say that because most of our registered workforce are registered and regulated through UK bodies. So the GMC is a UK regulatory body. It's what gives doctors their regulation to practice. So something that was ostensibly Scottish, but actually required flexibilities in this space here that weren't forthcoming, could actually be a bit of smoke and mirrors. Okay. But if we've got government agencies who are working together to say this is different and is discreetly organised in a way that's appropriate, and as a result of that, these other things that are necessary, so whether that's a subdivision within GMC regulation or NMC regulation or anybody else's regulation for that matter, or whether it's the creation of some Scottish bit of that, but as a principle to reflect, and in particular to reflect the significant challenges that we have in rurality. That would be something that would be quite attractive to us, but the full Monty, as opposed to the appearance of something that was flexible when in fact what the machinery that existed behind it wasn't.
Okay, and I'm a bit puzzled following, and Mr. Lambert's not here at the moment, but he mentioned the possibility of this having some sort of, I guess, differentiated approach, potentially impacting on recruitment from the rest of the UK, and I'm not quite clear, under current arrangements anyway, how that might be, how that would manifest itself.
Yeah, I'm not sure what Mr. Lamont had in his mind in that questioning. I took that as an additional bit of regulation to cross our borders.
So just some sort of...
But some sort of Scottish pack or whatever, and... Right. I'm not quite sure where that was. Right. But my point is rather more about the sort of government arrangements. In the absence of knowing what the offer is going to be,
yes,
it's one thing to say, and of course Scotland has a discrete set of whatevers. If that is then predicated by a GMC regulation that says this is a UK-wide scheme, so irrespective of what these individual nation components say, we're going to apply this, then that might be something quite challenging.
So you definitely buy in from those sorts of bodies.
Yeah, I mean,
but that's surely not insurmountable.
No, it shouldn't be. But it's about, as I say, it's about how people set out to do things. It's about how organisations set out to achieve the same aim. Right. I don't think that should be insurmountable for us to organise.
Okay, good, thank you.
I mean, it's the same question I asked at the end of the last session. I think the feeling is that the UK would look to address some of these issues on a UK-wide basis. If there is an issue identified, social care, for example, this will be something that will be framed and designed that will meet the needs right across the United Kingdom. Is there anything anything specific to Scotland that you feel might need particular attention or a different set and range of policies when it comes to immigration in your sector?
I've already made reference to the geographical extent. It is increasingly difficult to deliver social care in some of our remote communities. And though there have been innovative models around worker cooperatives, local community-based care, those can only go so far, some of them. So we do have a real criticality around rurality in some of our remote areas. We have a dependency level, we have differences in terms of mortality, life expectancy, we have different clinical needs in the Scottish context. So both the systems of the delivery of care and health are different across the United Kingdom, and appreciation in any modelled migration needs to be sensitive to that differentiation.
I think what I'm hearing back in that response is the two big issues which I sort of identified in the various evidence sessions we've had in this inquiry and the previous ones is geography and dependency, the dependency ratio, which I think we identified in our last inquiry as being substantially larger than the rest of the United Kingdom and some of the challenges of geography. Could you just talk a little bit about, I represent a rural constituency and, a number of care homes in the Highland part of my area, and it doesn't seem to be that they seem to be understaffed or under-resourced. Is there a particular challenge about getting people into your sector in some of the rural areas? Could you talk us through what the difficulties are there?
I think some of the challenges in rural areas are that, if I can think of my own family context, which is in the northwest, yes, there is a care home operating in an island community delivering high-quality care and support. It is being staffed essentially by agency staff. And Scottish Care's submission will have highlighted to you that on average, there's one national nursing agency at the moment charging £1,000 a night for a shift. So those care providers, particularly in rural areas, are sustaining the delivery of high quality care, but it comes at an absolutely unsustainable cost. So yes, there is the ability to have staff, but they may not be local and they may be quite literally bussed in. So we do have real challenges, probably less in the care home, but certainly in the care at home and housing support sector in delivering in our most rural communities.
I know we're approaching the closed, Chair, so this could be just a very simple yes or no question. Dr McCaskill, you mentioned a few times that social care is seen as a drain and it should be seen more as an economic driver. I just want to be clear, does that include the encouragement of private enterprise in the sector? And if so, what barriers do you see to that?
I think it's the totality. The Competition and Marketing Authority report in the care home sector, which came out 3 weeks ago, highlighted that things are being done differently in Scotland. There is an incentivisation for investment, which we need to continue. Together with colleagues in COSLA, I'm involved in ongoing discussions about how we can incentivise the sector. So, yes, there is a distinctive opportunity for the totality of care, voluntary, statutory, private, across Scotland.
Just very quickly, I learned last week that my constituency of East Rimshire is unusual and it actually has positive inward migration of over 85s, which is fairly remarkable. But the truth is that constituencies like mine and general demographics mean we're going to need more people to be working in social care and related sectors, and they're going to have to come from somewhere, whether or not it's UK nationals or from abroad.
Absolutely, and I know your constituency, having formerly been a resident in it, and
I hope
it's
you
a
didn't
very...
move just after June. I hope that wasn't a sign of...
I can't possibly make a comment. No, it was before. But it's a very attractive place for individuals who are older, who want a degree of safety, security and attractiveness. I'm building up your constituency here. But any such community will require significant increased contribution in terms of social care. The plan which was published on Friday is a first stab and a first attempt at a number of stakeholders to try to identify the gaps. But it makes very clear itself that without our flexibility and ability to recruit from a wider pool than the pool we have at the moment, all our talk about careers progression, increasing salaries will come to naught. We need people to care, not just statistical numbers on a sheet.
Mr. Rogers.
In your question, you asked for things that you thought made Scotland distinctly different.
Yes.
And Donald's picked up already things like the population demographic and the issues about recruitment in rural areas. There are two things that I wanted to add to that, and then a sort of more general point. Depending on the rules that eventually come into play, in rural Scotland in particular, we're thinking about our GP communities. Those are often very small practices where, and indeed often single person practices or a couple of people practices, and not atypically from quite a high proportion of European, quite a high proportion of couples who provide general practice services. So there is quite an intense issue about recruitment in those areas to those rurality. The more optimistic point that I wanted to make in that space was that because of its rurality, Scotland is incredibly innovative in the way that it delivers healthcare. And much of that innovation has been done hand in hand with Northern European colleagues who provide, particularly around Scandic countries and various other parts. We've done quite a lot of work with people from around the rural parts of Europe to look at innovation around how people access services, which is not just about broadband and stuff like that, but it's about how people can engage with the community and how we can provide services that are innovative to support people in the community. And the final point I wanted to make in terms of the larger numbers of people that we need to go into both health and social care at the lower end is that all of that debate is taking place at a time when we have relatively high employment.
I'm just looking around with my colleagues here. I think all of us have got high employment, and maybe my Labour colleagues at the maybe prosperous areas where it's very difficult. Recruitment is an issue anyway before we even start to get into the difficulties.
And that's not me suggesting that at times of high unemployment you can be, cavalier about how you recruit. Quite the contrary. We always want to have a good employment experience for people who work with us. But at the moment we are doing that in the field where I mentioned earlier on that 1.5 out of 10 kids at school have to want to go into health and social care at the same time as they're being attracted into teaching and policing and banking and hairdressing and farming and everything else.
Well, we're very, very grateful to both of you for very compelling evidence, and thank you very much for coming along. Same as everybody else. If there's anything further that you feel you could be usefully contributed to this inquiry, please submit that and it will gratefully be received and accepted. Thank you just now.
Thank you.
We have our next panel. Thank you. Nice to see you both again. Just for the record, who you are, who you represent, and anything by way of a short introductory statement. We'll start with you, Mr. MacLeod.
Thank you, Mr. Wishart. Good morning. I'm Willie MacLeod. I represent the British Hospitality Association, which is a UK-based organisation looking after the interests of the wider hospitality sector. I look after the interests of our members in Scotland. I think the introductory remarks I would make are, I think you've heard quite a few of the concerns already from other sectors this morning that we would bring to your attention, but our real concern is our ability to sustain and fuel the growth of hospitality and tourism businesses in the UK and in Scotland if we're denied access to a labour market that over the last 20 years or so, I guess, has helped us fuel the growth in our sector. Mark will talk more perhaps about tourism, but I think the other point I'd make is that we tend to think of hospitality as simply our hotels and restaurants and pubs, but the industry goes far beyond that into, for example, food service in all the walks of life that we find in hospitals, in workplaces and elsewhere. And in Scotland, we account for about 304,000 employees, with a GVA to the Scottish economy of 6.1 billion, so we're a pretty significant industry.
Good morning. My name is Mark Crothall. I'm the Chief Executive of the Scottish Tourism Alliance. We're the overarching trade body for the industry in Scotland. We have roughly 75–80% of tourism businesses of all types sitting under our umbrella of membership. Our role, of course, is to represent their interests, but importantly, we have another role, which is to act as the guardians of Scotland's national tourism strategy, which is a strategy for everybody, and we are nearing its first sort of conclusion in 2020, with an ambition to obviously grow and continue to grow. We've experienced a great swell and a positive upturn in visitation, but certainly we're seeing changing markets. As Willie's touched on, we go by the mantra that tourism is everyone's business, and it's great to see that you're making it your business today. And for that reason, I suppose, not just being solely typically hospitality, it's thinking around the supply chain that actually makes the tourism industry tick, whether it be in the transport sector, to the laundry providers, to our producers who enable us to put food on the table. We're of course, we're an international, we're a global industry as well, and we're seeing significant changing demographic of visitation, cultures coming our way, and for Scotland to be competitive, we need to ensure that we're able to respond and give that quality experience that travellers of today and tomorrow and the future beyond that are expecting. We have recently conducted some research, independent research, into the confidence and the concerns or the challenges that are faced by the industry, and with over 400 businesses replying from across all different sector groups and different geographies, one of the most significant concerns is around the ability to attract, retain a workforce that is going to be fit for the future and sufficient in size for the future, with gaps and things we already have. So delighted to be here today to contribute and answer any questions that you have.
Right, thank you both very much for that. Given out heavily reliance and dependency on tourism and hospitality in my constituency, I know that non-UK workers are pretty critical to both your sectors. Could you maybe start to talk just a little bit about the value of non-UK workers in your sector, and maybe give us some sort of sense of the size of the proportion that we're talking about here?
Well, I think I mentioned in my opening remarks that hospitality employs, I think the precise figure is 304,000 in Scotland, according to recent research. We commissioned, in March, we had a report produced for us by KPMG that began to look at the impacts of Brexit on our sector, because we realised very early on that we're a highly dependent sector, and we began to identify the concerns about our future workforce. I think it's important to put things in context. Out of the 300-odd thousand we employ, about 250,000 will be UK citizens, not all Scots, but we have a very high proportion of UK people working in our industry, but about 40,000 in Scotland are EU citizens, and there's a further around about 20,000 who are non-EU, primarily people who've come in on Tier 2 visas, and they would be in the main Asian chefs and working in Asian or similar restaurants.
Obviously, I'd support and back up what Willie has just said. I mean, the mix is significant, but the wider migrant workforce is also a big percentage of our sector too. And we're a growing sector. We have gaps as well, which is obviously one that we can't afford to allow to widen further. I think where people first have done some sort of breakdown into where that split sits, and the predominance of the migrant worker and the EU worker in particular sits within the hospitality, pub, restaurant sector, where we have other sort of accommodation, smaller accommodation properties, etc., as well as attractions. There isn't as big a dependency, but the gravitation is towards those particular.
Is there any particular reason that we find so many non-UK workers in your sector, and is there any difficulty you've identified in recruiting Indigenous-based Scots to come and work in your businesses?
I think a lot has to do with the relative buoyancy of hospitality and tourism in Scotland. We're a labour-intensive industry, so we need people to deliver service. So our industry is growing, as Mark's alluded to. I think also Scotland is a welcoming country. I think if I look back into the history of the hospitality industry, hospitality hotel luminaries like Lord Forty, his family came to Scotland before the Second World War. Sir Stakis came here from Cyprus. So we have a long history of welcoming people to Scotland who have skills in our industry and have demonstrated their ability to grow businesses. I think we've had immigration pre-World War II, post-World War II. So, and I think also Scotland hasn't experienced some of the greater pressures of immigration that some parts of the rest of the UK have seen. So I think we're a welcoming country. I think we have a history of employing people in our industry.
What about Indigenous Scots specifically?
Yeah, I would say, we have a reputation of being pretty good at what we do as well. I mean, globally as a destination, we're very much seen as a destination to want to visit, to go to. We're, again, fortunately a safe destination as well in the current climate, and therefore opportunity does exist. So and when we've seen many of our migrant workers come together with partners as well, or families, it's not just independent. So being able to come to a country which is, as Willie said, has a reputation of being very welcome and open is something I think that is caused the volume to increase in the demand there, but worryingly so. Since the Brexit vote in recent times, in particular over the summer season, we have seen a significant decline in interested applicants, and for reasons that are varied, I would think, but not to mention the decline in the pound, of course, being one of those. But there is serious concern of how do we actually do more to attract and encourage people to come and settle.
If I could amplify that briefly, I don't think we've seen wholesale departures of non-UK citizens or EU nationals. I think we're seeing a greater wariness about some of these people in coming to the UK and to Scotland because of uncertainty, and also because of the difficulty in repatriating earnings because of the devaluation of sterling, as Mark says.
Thank you. Paul Masterton.
Thanks, gentlemen. Just the same question I've been asking the other panels about the conflict of differentiation between the very unrestrictive current position for EU nationals and very restrictive position for individuals outside the EU, and whether or not that's caused your industries any particular issues, and whether particular the amount of restrictions on non-EU nationals causes difficulties.
We have had discussions with MAC over a period of years about the restrictions on particularly Tier 2 entry. And that, in our instance, there's a great shortage of chefs in our industry, for example. And the ability to recruit chefs from out with the EU has been quite a significant issue for us going back over a period of time. There are restrictions on these Tier 2 visas, namely with salary thresholds and also with the cap on the numbers that can come in under that particular category. I think there is another related issue. As we've been looking at the issue of Brexit, I think it's the Migration Observatory at Oxford University has some data that says that 96% of the EU citizens who've come in to work in our industry would be denied access under Tier 2 arrangements. They're that restrictive. So I think the point I would like to make is that something in future based around Tier 2 without significant changes to that would not be the solution to our future recruitment requirements. We need something more flexible and far-reaching, much more far-reaching than that.
I mean, I suppose just a quick follow-up, the UK government position has tended to be one of the reasons for the very high restrictions on non-EU citizens is because of the flexibility within the EU. So do you therefore see any future migration policy post-Brexit as being a bit of a rebalancing act to kind of slightly more equate the position for anybody, anywhere in the world?
Well, I think it would have to be more flexible, and I think we'd have to revisit the shortage occupation list. I think there is a tendency to think that the employees we need are unskilled, for example. Well, I would challenge that by saying that delivering service to the great British or the great global population actually requires a lot more skill than we would credit these individuals with.
Thank you.
Yeah. Quick follow-up question. It's interesting you mentioned about MAC, and we've heard from former witnesses today just that MAC doesn't seem to be listening when they are approaching them with issues around perhaps dropping the need for quite as strict qualification levels as are currently demanded and so on. Is that your feeling about it? I mean, you've obviously had dealings with them as well.
Well, it's mainly my London-based colleagues who've had dealings, but I think probably they haven't been listening in a sense because they maybe haven't had to, because we've had such flexibility with EU labour.
EU citizens, right, okay.
We've made a fairly comprehensive submission to MAC in relation to the research they're currently doing for the UK government, and we've suggested that we would go along and see them. So far, there's been no response to that. Mark and I did meet MAC a couple of months ago on a very truncated visit to Scotland. I think we managed to buttonhole them with quite a few of the points we wanted to make, but we could have done with much more time.
Yes.
And at the moment, I'm relying on my London colleagues to make submissions to MAC, although we've contributed to a submission to MAC through the Tourism Skills Group, which is part of the tourism strategy delivery mechanism.
And just further, sorry, Chair, but I mean the whole flexibility around, you mentioned chefs and the difficulty that there is at the moment in attracting chefs from non-EEA countries. Do you think that the salary threshold, in terms of the flexibility you're hoping to get, the salary threshold's what, 35,000, then there's the immigration charge of £1,000 per individual per year, which really sort of knocks out a lot of smaller businesses from even applying to that. Do you think that therefore tends to weight things in favour of London and the southeast of England, simply because you have a larger operation, you've got higher salary levels generally? Do you think that's an added case for some sort of flexible approach?
That shortage is really UK-wide.
Yes.
I mean, the industry is doing quite a bit to try and train more chefs. I think the fact is that we have fairly high, large gross turnover in all levels of staff anyway, about 30% per annum.
Yeah.
But demand is effectively outstripping supply for skilled individuals. We need more of them. And if there's an opportunity to come on to it later, I mean, the BHA, we have developed a 10-year plan that we're promoting.
Yeah, I saw that.
To try and address the issue by making our industry a lot more attractive to UK employees in the future.
But if it was possible to vary the salary threshold, for example, in Scotland, and lower that so that it was easier, I mean, just as a way of approaching it, that would...
A lower threshold and a larger number would help. Yes.
Yeah, okay, thanks.
I think Just looking back on that, I think the the rising cost of doing business for businesses is something that's we've presented as a compound of costs that are coming into the industry as a whole to be able to recruit. So anything that is of a lower amount and attracts more. And let's not lose sight of the global traveller of today. They are expecting a real diverse offering of culinary experience. Not everybody is coming here to have traditional Scottish fare. They're expecting in a big city to have a real choice option. So therefore, the skill sets of required are going to have to be drafted in and hopefully then shared and taught to local homegrown Scots as well.
Indeed, yeah. Okay.
The latest UK migration statistics show an increased outward migration and a reduction in inward migration of EU nationals. But Mr MacLeod, you said earlier that you don't really see that in Scotland, or at least in the hospitality sector.
We haven't seen a wholesale departure, but I think we're seeing fewer people expressing interest in coming to the UK and Scotland to work in our industry.
So the second half of my question is about that. We've already heard today about the uncertainty around Brexit, the reduction in the value of the pound. What other factors, or in your respective sectors, are having an impact on that?
I think that there's a combination around the locality, the community, the impact of affordable housing, where you can actually settle and stay. Are you able to stay for the long term, to enjoy it? I mean, some of the shortfall has perhaps been the seasonal workforce that has typically been the ones attracted to come and work for a short-term period, and there's been barriers in that. And going back to currency, obviously, the value of the pound not being as appealing, but difficult to quantify, I suppose, anything specific. But as Willie alluded to, it's certainly the indicators we're seeing now that there is not enough of a pool. There were 2 hoteliers last week who were about to open a property in Edinburgh and another property in Glasgow, and their typical method of recruitment has been through using Gumtree and various other methods at all. They didn't have a single application from any EU national at all for work in there, and it would have been full-time employment.
I think that I mean, there is still, despite what we've heard in recent weeks, I think there is still considerable uncertainty over the position after March 2019. We're anticipating a transition period. We're not quite sure what the position on EU employees during that transition period will be. There's more certainty over settled status and permanent residency, but I think there is still there's uncertainty on the part of people here and already here, and I think there's uncertainty and maybe an unwillingness on the part of those who might think of coming to the UK to work if they're not absolutely sure if the environment they're coming into or what the negotiations we're seeing happening will lead to.
You talked about KPMG report,
yes,
which you're doing on Brexit. Perhaps you could share that with the committee. I don't know if we've got copies of that. And just what were your conclusions and findings when you've been looking at this?
Very happy to share that with the committee. I think we may have shared it with the committee last March when I spoke to you about sustainable employment. But we can check with your colleagues, but make sure that that's delivered to you. The broad conclusion was that in the event of the loss of free movement, no significant reduction in unemployment in the UK. We're very fortunate to have high levels of employment in the UK, but without significant reduction in unemployment levels. The broad conclusion is that our industry is the midpoint of KPMG's estimates is that we're going to need 60,000 or so, 62,000 new employees each year to sustain vacancies, fill vacancies, and sustain anticipated growth in 62,000 per annum.
Where on earth do we find them?
UK.
Well, at the moment we've been finding them largely from Europe.
Yeah.
This is the 10-year plan we are proposing. What we're suggesting to the UK government is that there has to be a gradual change to the immigration system to allow the industry to begin to cope with the loss of a declining number of EU people coming to work in the industry, or indeed more flexibility for non-EEA citizens to come here. Our plan is to work very much with the education sector to build on initiatives that we've had running for some time. A big hospitality conversation since 2013 created
With all due respect, with that, we've heard from all the sectors today, they're all going to do that. They're all going to have big education exercises. They're all going to start new forms of recruitment. I mean, like, if you're talking you alone as a sector require 62,000. I don't know what the number was from social care, but it was certainly into tens of thousands too. I mean,
that I think absolutely illustrates the scale of the problem the industry is facing. I mean, we have some of the biggest hospitality employers, national and international chains, who are backing this 10-year plan because they are extremely concerned that without the ability to recruit an adequate workforce, the viability, the sustainability of these businesses is very much a question. We're a labour-intensive industry, and our ability to improve productivity through automation, for example, is fairly limited. The industry is taking certain steps, but we're still very much service-oriented, labour-intensive industry. We need people. And without people of that order of magnitude, our growth, our ability to run our existing businesses is going to be severely constrained.
Grateful. Ross Thompson.
Mr MacLeod, you already sort of touched on this in a previous answer, but the UK government has published proposals for the rights of EU citizens who are living here in the UK. And as you'll be aware, the UK and the EU have now agreed in principle how this will be dealt with post-Brexit. Are you reassured in any way by the status of EU nationals who are already working here? And beyond that, are there any further concerns that will still need to be addressed?
I think the status of those who have been here for 5 years and those who've been here for a shorter period and can build up to the 5 years, I think that reassures a lot of people who are already here. I think the issue is what happens after March 2019, which isn't that far away. What will happen during let's assume there's a transition period. What will happen during the transition period. The critical thing is what immigration policy will be in place after the transition period. And we're assuming that there would be some sort of numerical cap on immigration to the UK, that there would be some form of quota and work permit. We would argue for the most flexible, less bureaucratic, low-cost work permit system there can be. We would argue that permits would be subject to renewable, that they would exist for a reasonable length of time, perhaps 5 years, to give people a certain amount of security. So we recognise that there will be changes, but we have set out in our submission to MAC what the changes we would prefer to see coming about. And we're very open to discussing these with MAC and anyone else who wants to listen for that matter.
Grateful. Just on your MAC-related issues, I was trying to explore with our previous guest the representations and how this process works. I mean, obviously, you've made representations as a sector to MAC previously. Has this been received favourably, and I mean, as a process, how would you rate it, and what's your experiences been of dealing with them?
I personally, I haven't been involved in these discussions. I think the position in relation to MAC has become more acute as we understand more about the implications of Brexit. So the ability to influence MAC and get MAC to listen, I think, is quite important. I think it's a matter of regret that the UK government perhaps did not commission MAC to look at this issue before it did. We're not anticipating the report, I think, until August next year. Well, August 2018 is getting pretty close to March 2019 for businesses to be planning and looking ahead and reacting to what MAC is going to say based on the representations it's had from ourselves and other sectors of the economy.
And just on Mr Thompson's question just about the UK solution for EU nationals, I mean, my impression, just in my experience in my constituency, is that most EU nationals probably haven't been here for 5 years. We work in your sectors. It's more of a seasonal drop-in, drop-out type employment where you mentioned the large turnovers. I imagine they'd come and work for a couple of years in a hotel in Pitlochry and then decide that they're going on to do something else. I mean, does what the arrangements that are currently in place, like for EU nationals, does it satisfy you in terms of looking after your sector?
There's evidence of those seasonal workforce individuals that they return year on year. It's the same people coming back, and it's allowing them to return is something that obviously saves a lot of costs, particularly where you've got a business that trades seasonally as well. So knowing that you will have consistency. The fact that they've chosen to return year on year has been a positive thing, albeit there are those that are stopping now. I think creating opportunities, which is really looking at how do we address seasonality as an industry as a whole, to have that continuity throughout the year. People don't come to Scotland for the weather. We know that, and there is a lot of focus now on spreading and needing to spread the tourism season, and therefore, offering up not just that seasonal opportunity, but a longer-term employment potential, which is there.
But it's not really a seasonal phenomenon, this. A lot of our businesses operate 12 months of the year. And I think the overall figure, the KPMG research, slightly different from the work that Mark mentioned that People First, the Sector Skills Council had done. But KPMG are showing 14% of our employees in Scotland are from the EU. Now, that figure can be as high as 50 or 55% in a city centre hotel. And we do see seasonal inflow and outflow of EU workers, but we also see stability amongst immigrant workers right through the industry, but also in the cities. They're setting up home here, they're marrying Scots or residents of Scotland, they're having families, they're staying here. So they are, in many respects, many of these people are a permanent fixture of our community, and they're a very welcome fixture. And these are the people who I think are seeing the reassurance that if they have 5 years residency, or they can build up to 5 years residency, they've got the ability to stay here. They have that settled status that's been offered to them.
Great. Tommy Shepherd.
You've touched on this already, but we're waiting on the UK government to publish proposals for migration from the European Union after 2019. We don't know what that's going to be. I mean, I suppose at one end of the spectrum there's a possibility that it may go towards the situation for the rest of the world, which I presume would be deleterious for your industry. So my question is, what sort of, do you see the need for a separate set of EU arrangements post-2019? What do you think they could be?
Ideally, we'd like to see EU citizens being able to come here and look for a job and perhaps obtain a work permit, perhaps sponsored by an employer. I think anything that required a bureaucratic and costly application process before people came here would actually be pretty detrimental to our industry. I'm probably old enough to remember applying for work permits for non-UK staff in the hospitality industry 40 years ago, and I can tell you it was a very time-consuming and laborious process. I'm sure you all know that if you need an employee, certainly in our industry, if you need somebody on Monday, you need them on Monday, not 3 months on Monday, which could be the position if you have to apply for a time-consuming work permit. So I think flexibility, and we recognise there would have to be some changes after Brexit, but I think it has to be flexible. I think there has to be recognition of the needs of our industry and indeed others. And I think we would argue that the MAC should have a role in future not dissimilar to that of the Low Pay Commission, where it's independent of government, it takes account of evidence, and it offers advice to government.
Just to be clear, are you talking about visa-free arrangements but you have to get a work permit to work?
Certainly prefer to see visa-free, but we recognise that there may have to be a permit system and there may have to be quotas, but these quotas should recognise the needs of industry.
Potentially by geography as well. I mean, having been somebody on the other side of the fence who's worked around the world and had to go through applications for work permits and processes, etc., it became a barrier and it stopped me travelling. So I think we have to enable it to be as simple and as easy as possible for somebody to want to come and work here. But if there is a control system, a work permit that is also non-costly, and putting any barrier in the way for people coming to grow, where we've highlighted we have a significant gap in our workforce already. We're a high demand country. We have big volumes of people to cater for, and we have a gap where to be able to skill a homegrown workforce to the scale and the level that we want to will take a 10-year period at the moment now. So.
Just a quick question. It's been suggested by some witnesses formally that some form of Scottish representation on the MAC would be helpful. Would that be something you'd welcome too? Because there's currently nothing.
I don't think we'd resist it.
No. Yeah. Yeah. Okay. You think that might help help them adopt a slightly more flexible approach to Scotland's needs, for example?
I think so, because I think Mark and I would agree that I think there is a greater recognition in Scotland than at UK government level of the importance of our industries to the Scottish economy.
Well, that's interesting. It's I've said before. As well.
I would say very definitely that is the case. And I mean, our engagement with MAC, as I say, it was 2-3 months ago, was a fairly last-minute request, and it was fortunate that we happened to have a tourism skills group meeting at the same time, where obviously much of this, the raising the appeal of the industry is one of our key objectives in the action plan that sits there. But the time spent with the group and what appeared to be quite a lack of understanding and appreciation of tourism's importance to the economy in Scotland was evident.
Thank you.
That's what I was going to ask, and it's something I'm pretty certain the UK government, when they're sitting across the table from us, are going to say and suggest is that what you're talking about is specific to the whole of the United Kingdom. Like the tourism sector, the hospitality sector will need a solution just the same as Scotland will. When we're looking at the issues and implications for Scotland, is there anything distinct or different about what you do in Scotland that would need to be treated differently from the rest of the UK?
I think the industry, the characteristics of the industry, how we operate, are probably UK-wide, and indeed a lot of our companies are cross-border, both ways, headquartered in Scotland and operating south of the border and vice versa. I think there has to be a UK solution. I mean, certainly my colleagues and I thus far have been resistant to a Scotland solution in terms of immigration, having regional quotas or regional permits. I think we're becoming, and the reason for that was really flexible, possibly restrictions on flexibility of movement of people, because we're a cross-border industry. People come from London to work in Edinburgh, people go from Edinburgh to work in Cardiff. We've got cross-border companies that want to shift people around and offer promoted posts, and and that applies to non-UK workers as well as to those born and bred here. I think to a certain extent we are now probably more open to discussion on the merits or otherwise of regional solutions, and indeed I think the Scottish Government's been arguing that. And I think Alistair Darling was also arguing
sub-national immigration policy like Australia and states do and Canada has been. Surely then, and therefore, if we're able to offer a different type of immigration experience and system to the rest of the United Kingdom, sure it's going to be good for your industries.
I'm not sure my London colleagues would agree with me entirely, but from a Scottish perspective, I think that would be positive.
Yeah. Yes, very definitely. I think it would be positive, and particularly in the rural communities as well, where you've got, you know, a workforce age profile which is obviously challenged, and the popularity of and the opportunity to grow tourism in outside the main central belt is significant. You only have to look at the rise in cruise tourism as an example. 650,000 passengers into Scottish ports this summer, 800,000 next year. We need more people in the rural communities to be able to respond and service those types of audiences. So controlled and pocketed, yes, is a possible way of doing it. But as Willie's absolutely right, we have a number of our businesses who are cross-border. And I think one of the appeals of working in our industry is to have that flexibility of to be able to grow your career and develop it by moving around the world, or certainly within the UK, I would see as not being something that you would put a barrier in the way of doing that.
Just lastly for me, and one of the things that you do propose, which I think is actually quite a possibly ingenious proposal for your sector, is this idea of the sectoral work permit system. And have you presented this to government at all? Has this been something you've suggested to the MAC? And very briefly, how would it operate?
We have mentioned it in our submission to MAC. I think we'd prefer to see something operating at the UK level. But speaking for Scottish businesses, you know, if there had to be a uniquely Scottish situation, we would welcome that. But I think the devil will be in the detail. If it prevented people from moving within an organisation, say Hilton, for example, or one of the main branded restaurant chains.
Sorry, Willie, we've not got much time, so I just want to know how a sectoral work permit would work. I mean, is it a quota?
It would effectively be looking at a quota of. Right.
So you'd go to government and say the hospitality sector needs.
We need
50,000 people across the United Kingdom.
Well, 62,000 is the figure.
62,000. Yeah. And so you would suggest this, and then you would expect the government then to give this permit to the sector. Anybody who's coming in to work in your sector would seamlessly get this.
And that would be reviewed periodically with the MAC acting as an independent body, taking account of evidence from industry and making recommendations to the government on the needs of particular industries. And then the recruitment would be up to individual businesses within that overall national quota.
Have you had a favourable response?
We've had no response from MAC thus far, but we stand ready to go and
Could you tell us how you get on with that one? Because
we're delighted
to. As a sector, I mean, you're the first sector that's come here and you've suggested a way and a means to deal with this in the immigration system. So, you know, like I think credit has to be acknowledged with all that. You know, it would be obviously a solution if it was to be granted, though I remain to see what UK government say about that. But thank you both ever so much. It's been really, really interesting. And once again, you know, anything further, your KPMG report, for example, I think we'd all like to have a good look at that one. But thanks again for turning up to the Scottish Affairs Committee. Order, order.